Literature professors are afraid that if students study film and media, they'll stop reading. And when I first had my first job in 1990, I was in a department that was very committed to the canon of literature, and I was seen as a threat. I am a professor of literature and film studies, and I'm also the administrative director of film studies and of media at Claremont McKenna College, and a member of the Intercollegiate Media Studies program. So the courses I do are mainly in film, media, and culture. This semester, for example, I'm doing a course on film and mass culture that looks at conceptions of the masses in cinema and by cinema. And I'm also doing a course on film theory, a somewhat more specialized topic, but a very good thing for advanced film media students to study. Well, I'll first say it's not common within the field at all, and it's always been a bit of an uphill battle for me. For example, when I went to graduate school, there really weren't places where you could study literature and film in tandem, and I had to look hard for a place where I could do that. Upon graduation, I discovered what I really already knew, which was that academia is a deeply specialized province. So people might dabble in film if they do literature, but I've always thought of the two as deeply intertwined, and that film is literature by other means. They're both narrative arts in the largest sense, film and literature, and they both are embedded in the culture in similar ways. So as long as I can remember, I've just thought of them as very much having an affinity with each other. And as a specialist in modernism, my main specialism is modernism, I believe that modernist studies is very limited by the inability of modernist scholars, of many of them, to look beyond literature in an understanding of what modernism is or was. Yes, well, the first wave of modernism was a group of writers like Joyce and Woolf who were deeply interested in film, which was a new medium at the time. Joyce ran a cinema in Dublin briefly and was very influenced by the techniques of cinema, the ways that you cut from shot to shot, particularly experimental ways of cutting from shot to shot, like montage, which is a very discontinuous, fragmented style of editing that was pioneered in Russia by Sergei Eisenstein, great filmmaker of the 20s. In fact, Eisenstein wanted to make a film version of Ulysses using the montage technique. That's Joyce's most famous novel. And Joyce wanted him to. And it's a terrible pity that it never happened. Woolf, Virginia Woolf, also wrote on cinema and talked about its affinities with literature. So to me, it's always been surprising that modernism hasn't simply been a literature-film nexus. You know, you can certainly find plenty of people in modernist studies who look to film and other media and congruent forms to better understand modernism as a cultural formation. But to me, it's a given, a self-evident thing. So that would be one example among many. Literature professors are afraid that if students study film and media, they'll stop reading. And when I first had my first job in 1990, I was in a department that was very committed to the canon of literature, and I was seen as a threat. And, So it seems to me that it's that. And of course, that's less of an issue now. In the 90s, the canon, that is to say, the kind of accepted body of work that people are supposed to have read, came under question and has been questioned ever since. So obviously, there's a bit more of a liberty to range across fields. But, you know, one thing I would certainly say is, you know, you really have to have studied them to do it right, you know. I mean, I've always thought, you know, I did everything you had to do to get a PhD in literature and everything you had to do to get a PhD in film. So that's a lot. And, you know, I mean, people who kind of do an occasional film course, that's very welcome because I'm just in favor of film education as a principle. But there's a difference between somebody who's, you know, studied a thing and somebody who's looking into it. Well, so in my course on film and mass culture, we just did a unit on the film Philadelphia, which is the first Hollywood film on HIV/AIDS. So it's a big budget movie that stars Tom Hanks. He won an Oscar for playing the role, and it came out in 1993 at a very specific point of the AIDS crisis. So in studying it, of course, the students see the film, and we talk about their initial impressions, and then we try to broaden the field by looking at, for example, texts of that time on HIV/AIDS so they can get a sense of what the cultural attitudes were and think more about whether the film is reflecting them or pushing against them or what have you. In fact, the film is kind of pushing against them because it's a movie against homophobia and in favor of the non-marginalization of people with HIV/AIDS, whereas the dominant discourse in the United States in 1993 was not that. It was homophobic, and it was, you know, maybe we should, you know, put people with AIDS in, you know, isolation or something like that. And also I asked them to think about and look at movies made by LGBT people, of which there were many at the time, and contrast that with the way, you know, a Hollywood film that is not rife with LGBT people behind the scenes or in front of the camera handles it. So it's really kind of contextual reading, I would say. We look very closely at the text itself and the various calculations that the film is making. A Hollywood film is always kind of doing that to navigate its perceived various audiences. But we also think about it very much in terms of a much broader field of culture with as many points of reference as it's possible to bring in within the limits of a course. One is visual and one is verbal. So that's the broad definition, but that has all sorts of implications. How do you, for example, a film doesn't tend to describe, whereas a novel would be filled with description. What does that mean? What it means at perhaps the first level is that films just show a room and don't have to sort of break it down. But the viewer does. The viewer has to understand the signifiers on the screen and understand them as having been placed there often for a reason. And so the meaning gets generated from these visual markers, which work quite differently from, you know, how you parse a sentence. Well, certainly there's a lot of very, you know, sort of renegade work in cinema. But the mainstream cinema is, I would say, not particularly disruptive. The mainstream cinema has always taken its role to be to affirm and reinforce the status quo. And that there's a whole range of positions within that. So an infinite number of filmmakers who have attempted to do some kind of subversion of bad status quo elements, from within the system. To me, that's one of the most interesting things to study. But of course, one of the things we looked at in studying Philadelphia was the new queer cinema, which was a movement from 1987 through the 90s that was extremely disruptive. In fact, the word queer was a pejorative before the new queer cinema co-opted it and turned it into a kind of term of, acceptance. It came out of an academic movement, in fact, called queer theory that started in the early 80s and then gave rise to this very conceptual kind of cinema that included films like Todd Haynes' Poison or Cheryl Dunye's The Watermelon Woman. Cheryl Dunye I mentioned because she was a faculty member here. And in fact, there was a kind of key nexus between the Claremont colleges and the new queer cinema. And once again, I've sort of always, or as long as I can remember, thought this way, and I do creative writing as well as critical and scholarly writing. And to me, it's all writing. You're doing the same things, sort of thinking through a concept to its execution, and that always requires a certain kind of creative ability. A number of people in the literature department work similarly and think similarly. A number of people in the media studies program, in fact, our media studies program prides itself on synthesizing theoretical and creative models of thought. And that's what I'd say. They're all models of thought. And, once you come to terms with what thinking is, which is a proactive thing that you do, it's not a kind of thing you do before you act. It is itself action, and action is predicated on it, and so on. So I think once you think it through in those terms, it's just another matter of course, that of course they'd be intertwined. And in my own work, I haven't necessarily felt, it's just like the literature film thing, I haven't always felt, recognized in both areas. It's like people think, oh, he's the film person. Very few people think, oh, he's the creative writing person, though I've taught creative writing here frequently in the course of my time here and published a great deal in it. Well, of course, knowledge is always important, and especially in a time when I'm not sure that we have a collective understanding of our own culture. And part of what that means, of course, is that it's a very heterogeneous thing and people bring different models and levels of understanding to it, and that's all to the good. But it seems to me as if, we would benefit from a kind of historically inflected conversation of a lot of the issues that we're contending with now as a culture. Try to come to a fuller understanding of, where we've been. Look at what the culture has told us, what it's tried to tell us that wasn't right. So I think cultural studies can be a mechanism for untangling truth and untruth. Of course, you'd have to understand the multiple layers of culture because its messages are coming at so many different rates in a way. There used to be this idea, and sort of still is, that the function of culture was to interpolate the subject, as a theoretician would put it. In other words, to construct a sort of obedient, non-problematic citizen by giving them messages that do affirm sort of the way things are now and present that as it should be, and so on. But cultural studies, in a way, is by definition an effort to see through that, It was founded by Raymond Williams, a Marxist critic of the 1950s, who, of course, brought a very critical dimension to dominant discourses. So cultural studies has always been pursuing that legacy of critique.